Charlie Kirk was assassinated this past Wednesday. I want to start by introducing you to a former Utah state representative. His name's Phil Lyman, and he appeared on Steve Bannon's War Room show yesterday, and he related a story. He was in attendance at the event. He met Charlie Kirk before Charlie spoke on campus that day, and he was standing off to the side when Charlie Kirk was shot in the neck. And former Utah State Representative Phil Lyman relates a story to Steve Bannon. He says when he heard the shot fired into Charlie, he saw the reaction of all the students who were attending. There were several thousand students in attendance at Charlie Kirk's event, and most of them reacted the way that anybody would react in such a horrendous situation. They ducked for cover. They tried to hide. They tried to run away. They were screaming. Nobody really knew what was happening. You don't know if this is, a one shot fired or if this is going to be a mass shooter, if you're going to be a victim also. You don't know if it's one person or two people. Self-preservation, human nature calls for you to, run and duck and hide. However, former Utah State Representative Phil Lyman says that there were a group of what he describes to be LGBTQ-looking students who were in attendance at Charlie Kirk's event that day, who, when that shot was fired and everyone else was scrambling around and screaming and looking for a place to hide and running, they did none of those things. They seemed unafraid. They didn't run. They didn't duck. They didn't hide. They seemed like they knew something, according to former Utah State Representative Phil Lyman, that others in attendance at Charlie Kirk's event did not know. Take a listen.
Yeah, Steve, I think you said this morning that they're part of the dying Republican Party. That's the side of the Republican Party that needs to go away because they're not Republicans and they don't have our values. And I'll tell you one thing that, I was there on Wednesday. I spoke to Charlie in advance of that, and he brings the party with him. And it was a party. I mean, he's throwing hats, and these kids, they look to Charlie so much. Turns out they don't like being lied to any more than the rest of us do. And when they see things that happen that don't add up, it's hard to fool these kids. They've got their cameras. They're watching these things happen. So I went up top, the back of the venue, right when the gunshot happened. Now, I don't know if it was a gunshot. I don't even know what all of that was at this point. But the thing I noticed is that there were some people, while everyone was hiding behind the retaining walls and ducking down and, wondering what's going to come next, there were a group of kids who were not hiding. And it was kind of the LGBTQ. I walked right over and I said, and I heard one of them, utter a real nasty epithet, not to Charlie Kirk, or not to Charlie Kirk, but to the crowd that's running away, go F yourselves type of thing. And I said, was that gunshot not right here? And they said, yeah, it was right over there. The point being, they weren't afraid. They knew something. They knew something that the rest of the people in that crowd didn't know. They were not afraid. If the gunshot was right over there, if the gunshot was right behind them, why are they not hitting the ground? Why are they not running? Why are they not concerned for their lives?
Hold it.
I was afraid it was going to turn into a mass shooting. So I'm out there looking, where is this coming from?
Hang on.
Now, this comes, of course, and we discussed this on the show yesterday. The FBI is currently investigating whether there were any other individuals or any other groups, especially pro-trans groups, political activism groups. I mean, it's hard to even call them political activism groups. They're being investigated to see if they are pro-terrorism groups or if they had any foreknowledge of this horrendous crime that was committed, the assassination of Charlie Kirk. FBI Director Kash Patel revealed today that in the Discord chat, Discord is an app. It's a way that people communicate. There was a Discord group chat that included Tyler Robinson, in which Tyler Robinson admitted guilt for the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And Kash Patel told the United States Congress, he's told Senator Josh Hawley that there were at least 20 other people in that Discord group chat with Tyler Robinson. That means 20 other people, at least 20 other people in that Discord chat knew in the immediate aftermath, at the very least, what Tyler Robinson had done. And of course, the question is raised, did they know ahead of time? Were they in knowledge of anything? Did they aid and abet Tyler Robinson? Did he have any accomplices? At the same time that the FBI is investigating the people in these, or investigating whether anyone had any foreknowledge of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, there is another group in Utah called Armed Queers Salt Lake City. This was reported on by the New York Post. Armed Queers Salt Lake City and another group, it's a gaming group called Steam, but for the purposes of this moment, we're going to talk about Armed Queers specifically. They are a group of LGBTQIA identifying people, and the purpose of this group, and this is a quote, is to train gay, queer, and transgender people to arm themselves and fight against capitalism and the American system. This group, in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination, scrubbed their online presence. They deleted their Instagram account. And according to the New York Post, the FBI is investigating whether they had any foreknowledge or any association with Charlie Kirk's assassination. At the same time, and I know this is a lot of information, I want to get you this information before we bring Mike Benz on so that you have all the information you need for full context for our wide-ranging discussion. At the same time, Data Republican on X, you know Data Republican, she does deep dives into the financial ties or the associations between various groups. Money and NGOs are essentially fungible. Data Republican puts the pieces together to show you the connections of who's actually behind these efforts. Data Republican published a thread on X saying that this group, Armed Queers Salt Lake City, is not only an independent group, this group has actually gotten money and support from the United States government, from the State Department, and from the UN. The leader of Armed Queers SLC, her name is Ermaya Fanayan, was recognized by a State Department affiliated NGO called Utah Global Diplomacy as a recipient for the 7 for 17 award for advancing the UN's 17 sustainability goals. To call this a tangled web would be the understatement of the year. On top of that, in May of 2025, this group, Armed Queers SLC, this communist group that tries to train LGBTQIA people for resistance and to overthrow capitalism, they took a trip to Cuba, to the communist nation of Cuba. This trip was organized through a group called the National Network on Cuba. The acronym for that is NNOC. The National Network on Cuba, which is both linked to the communist government in Cuba, also has ties to U.S. non-governmental organizations. U.S. NGOs are members of this group, the National Network on Cuba. Many of these U.S. NGOs who are members of the National Network on Cuba are also NGOs linked to Neville Roy Singham NGOs. You cannot make this up. So I want to untangle this so that we understand exactly what's going on here, what's potentially behind what can very accurately be called the trans violence that took the life of our dear friend, Charlie Kirk. I want to bring Mike Benz. He's the executive director for the Foundation of Freedom Online. Mike Benz, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Good to see you, Liz.
All right, Mike, before we dive into the tangled web of NGOs, armed queers, and who they're associated with, where they're getting funding, what they might have done, I want to ask you a question that I think is on a lot of our minds in these days since Charlie Kirk's murder. And that is, it's been a long time in our country since we saw a political assassination like that. I mean, I think the last time we saw that, this significant of a political assassination was in the 1960s. When you are analyzing what happened and what motivated it and the reaction, the celebration from the left, the gaslighting from the mainstream media, what do you see? What are the implications? Do you think more assassinations like this are coming?
It's quite possible. I think everyone in this space with a large, loud microphone feels it. I mean, you hear left-wing influencers like Destiny proudly going on Piers Morgan, and I believe the quotes were something along the lines of, "This is a good thing because right-wingers need to fear talking in public." And then I think there was another quote that was something to the effect of, "Well, if you wanted Charlie Kirk to live, then you shouldn't have elected Donald Trump as president the second time." And these are folks with millions of followers, daily live streams. Charlie was a unique target of these online communities for a very long time because he was the most trusted person. I think a YouGov poll showed that Charlie Kirk was the single most trusted public figure for young men under the age of 30 years old. And Charlie not only built with his own hands the institutions on college campuses that young people on the left had to confront for ideological hegemony. There was nothing before that. College Republicans was always a joke. Turning Point completely changed the game, and Charlie was not only the face of Turning Point, but Charlie was a tall, cool as a cucumber figure who would walk right into the lion's den, take on 25 people at a time. I think the Jubilee video for Charlie Kirk going up against 25 college leftists is at 35 million views right now on YouTube. And he never lost. He was completely unflappable. And not only that, because he was so successful and so good at it, both institutionally and linguistically, it emboldened young people of Gen Z to speak up and aspire to be that eloquent, that influential, that proud and confident of their own beliefs. And so Charlie was singularly targeted by these online communities. And I think it's worth noting that this kind of assassination culture on the left, I think another YouGov poll showed that 25 or 26% of the far left endorses or is okay with political violence or assassination, whereas it was like 3% of the far right. I mean, it's like you're talking orders of magnitude in difference here. And I think a lot of this is because of the fearlessness, because there is a hard-edged far right, or at least there was, maybe you could argue, a decade ago as part of the primordial soup of the Trump movement. There were these groups like the Atomwaffen Division, if folks remember, and these kind of really crazy out there far right groups, but they were neutralized very quickly by the Federal Bureau of Investigations and the Justice Department. They were any group that even dared to utter half of a fraction of what the online left does today was so quickly infiltrated and entrapped by federal government operatives from the FBI, the DHS, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the Justice Department, that nobody anywhere on the right would go anywhere close to anyone who even suggested in coded language the stuff that is said by the online left out loud. The concept of Fed posting is something that looms very large, I think, in the online right, which is that everyone knows that if someone were to call for the assassination of a Barack Obama or a Joe Biden or or an online left influencer or the like, anyone who goes anywhere close to that language is not only socially shunned, but immediately called a Fed, because only Feds talk like that on the right. And we've seen so many of these just sweeping operations to take down any of these networks. And a lot of this is because the way the FBI defined domestic extremism, the way DHS did, the way our intelligence community did, the way our law enforcement did, was to define domestic extremism as a right-wing phenomenon coming from domestic paramilitary adjacent extremist groups. And it was effectively verboten to change that definition to include the left side of the political aisle. And not only that, you had institutional capacities built up within civil society to go after that. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars of federal grants to university centers, to NGOs, to civil society organizations to map the online right and to triage by extreme level. And then they functioned as essentially another arm of the Justice Department and the FBI. The SPLC would create these hate maps of hate groups. They even put a bullet sign, a target over these groups, and labeled TPUSA one of them, while the SPLC was partnered with the FBI and DHS to essentially serve as the extended investigation arm of the Federal Bureau of Investigations. And so the online left never really had to go through that process of purging its extreme elements because of the intense focus of law enforcement on it. And I think that has led to this wildly disproportionate level of restraint on the right and complete mask off, open fearlessness to Fed post. Although when they do it, it's not even Fed posting because they're not even apparently monitored by the Feds. Or
I
at
mean,
least
I
they
don't think
haven't been until
anything,
this week.
unless it has not yet been reported, I don't think Destiny suffered any repercussions for saying that conservatives should be assassinated. I mean, I remember seeing a poll, this is a couple months ago. I remember seeing a poll about how many leftists thought it would be okay if Elon Musk was assassinated. And it's one thing when you see a poll, it's another thing when you see these leftists celebrating an actual assassination that happened, the murder of a father and a husband, the murder of Charlie Kirk. It's horrifying. So, part of the assassination culture is exactly what you described. Part of it is that they have networks of these groups, whether it's armed queers. I mean, I'll be very interested, as the FBI is, to see if they had any foreknowledge of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, this Discord chat, who these people were, what they knew, or what they didn't know. But talk to me about what we do know right now. I mean, when armed queers, Salt Lake City, traveled to Cuba, there's a video, and I want to show this on the screen. There's a video of them saying, if we are terrorists, then we're proud to be terrorists. Can we play this, Spence?
Every class of Cuban society thinks like an organizer. And these students, who were regular medical students, they came and spoke, and basically what they were saying was, they were wearing their white coats, they looked like medical students. They were like, we're the reason that America's calling Cuba terrorist. And they were saying, well, if we're terrorists, we're proud to be terrorists because we're sending doctors around the world. And if that's our terror, then so be it,
Yep.
right? But here's this little island a couple of miles away from America, 90 miles away from America, and they have a president who talks like us. They have a president who understands the need for a liberated Palestine. And I think that was, that definitely altered my worldview as an organizer.
All right, so this individual who's speaking in this video is someone identified as Connor. I don't know what Connor's last name is or if that's his real name, but he has another quote. He said, "We were there in Cuba to learn the successes of the revolution and bring it back home with us. Keep in mind, the armed queers claim to abide by 6 principles. First principle is armed and militant protection of queer and trans communities, the end of capitalist oppression and exploitation, the creation of socialist society, trans liberation, and the abolition of prisons and police." That's what this group stands for. In July, there was a leader of the group that openly said, "We are a queer and trans-led Marxist-Leninist organization." Mike, I mean, what do you think of this?
Well, you pointed out some of the research that Data Republican put out just yesterday, and this dovetails with something I've been talking about for a very, very long time. Last year, when I was leading the crusade against the corruption at USAID, I would frequently point out how how transgender militancy has become a major tool of U.S. foreign policy. As we have lived in this era for the past decade of an undeclared second Cold War, not against left-wing communism, but against right-wing populism, in the same way that the Central Intelligence Agency, the State Department, USAID, all of their tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of grantee organizations and cutouts institutionally have tried to topple governments around the world or stop the rise of right-wing populist movements around the world, and this using the exact same levers of power that were done to stop left-wing communism during the Cold War, but this time to stop right-wing populism in Europe, in South America, in the United States, domestically. The LGBT, and particularly the T part of it, has become a major front in the same way that it's instructive to understand how the blueprint for this operates when you're trying to conduct a regime change or a people-powered bottom-up revolution in a country. What you try to do is you try to organize a coalition of the fringes, because you do not have the Democratic majority, because the only reason you activate these kind of mobs is because the State Department's preferred candidate did not win in a free and fair election. And so you need to destabilize the country and then have a minority of the voters oust the government in a violent, they call it a non-violent coup, but it's a violent coup. It is mobs of people on the streets, burning police cars, burning buildings, and causing an evacuation of the elected president so that the power vacuum can be filled by the U.S. State Department's newly picked puppet. This is what was done in Bangladesh last year. This was done in Ukraine in 2014. This is what's done with our color revolution playbook. And as part of that, getting the coalition of fringes together, what the State Department looks for is the most radical, extreme groups with the highest risk tolerance and the largest grievances against the elected government, who are willing to take the risks of putting their bodies in the streets, of confronting police officers, of being willing to get arrested, and often who don't have a lot of means. So a little bit of bribe money in the form of US aid or State Department money goes a very, very long way. And so you have this transgender global affinity network that the State Department, USAID, the intelligence services have been working with. Really, I mean, especially since the end of the Cold War. A lot of this started in the early 1990s as the U.S. State Department was trying to achieve political vassalage control over Central and Eastern Europe after those countries, after were respectively ceded by the Soviet Union and were now up for a democratic vote, but there was still a lot of legacy, cultural, and political affinity to the kind of Soviet Union paternalistic, heteronormative kind of machismo culture. And you see a lot of that in Central and Latin America as well. And so what you find is hundreds of millions of dollars of grants to these groups who then serve as boots on the ground. And it's not just the trans community, it's Antifa as well. Antifa is, a militant organization that is a global network and a global affinity network with partner cells at every civil society level, who serves as militant boots on the grounds to break up meetings, to assault or sometimes murder politicians who are rising in power. We saw this happen all over Europe with Antifa groups attacking political leaders in Spain, in Germany, in Italy, in France, and it's had the backing of the blob, of our foreign policy establishment. They've been financed. They are constantly coordinating. In Syria, there were Antifa cells who were part of the CIA Operation Timber Sycamore network. When the CIA ran its then largest CIA operation in declassified history from 2011 to 2016, the operation to train al-Qaeda and ISIS fighters to take down Bashar al-Assad, the Antifa networks were all over Syria as well. They had formal Antifa battalions who were State Department partners in that operation. And so you have these high risk tolerance radical groups. And, this is the sort of thing that was recruited on the right wing during the Cold War. If you look at, for example, the CIA memos from the 1980s about what to do in Nicaragua and El Salvador, where the CIA would publish memos about how to work with organized right-wing crime networks, and they would be the ones who would be willing to take to the streets, to use violence to achieve their means, who were willing to get arrested or potentially go out as a martyr in a gunfight or plant bombs or explosives. You hear this with operatives like Maria Stephan, who ran the Center for Nonviolent Action at the U.S. Institute of Peace, a government agency. And, I recently did a deep dive video on her work with the U.S. Institute of Mob Violence of, they call it peace, but it's complete violence. They literally advocate for property destruction and say property destruction does not count as violence.
Yeah,
because
that's what we heard the Black Lives Matter rioters, when they were committing arson and throwing rocks through windows and looting merchandise, they were like, "Oh, that's not violence. That's not a crime. That's just property." By the way, there's an Antifa connection to this armed queer Salt Lake City group. So that video that we showed of Connor, who was a member of Armed Queers, the guy in Cuba, talking about, if we're terrorists, then we're proud to be terrorists. The woman who was standing next to Connor in that video was the leader of the group. This is a woman named Ermaya Fanayan. She's the one who received the awards from the State Department affiliated NGO, so getting paid off as you described it before. But this same woman, so Armed Queers SLC, Salt Lake City, they co-hosted what they called educational workshops with the Elm Fork branch of the John Brown Gun Club. That is the Trans-Antifa perpetrators behind the July 4th ICE facility shooting in Texas. And Ermaya Fanayan, that same woman who's the leader of the Armed Queers group, the one that's in that video from Cuba, she appears to have promoted these so-called educational workshops on her private Instagram.
Yeah, it's all to be expected. You have this State Department Trans-Antifa network. They serve as militant boots on the ground in Europe, in South America, in Asia. And I pointed this out. It's when you're talking about these networks, you even see Republican support for it. I pointed this out in Bangladesh, for example, last year when the Biden administration ousted the democratically elected prime minister in a coup, in a violent people-powered revolution. And what was happening was the State Department was funding their little CIA cutout groups like the National Endowment for Democracy. Documents leaked online courtesy of the Gray Zone, who put out this fantastic reporting of the IRI, the International Republican Institute, which is the Republican wing of the National Endowment for Democracy, and their baseline assessment of the situation in Bangladesh and what options could be used by them with State Department money to destabilize the country, to bring it to its knees, because they did not expect to be able to win the next election of the State Department-backed candidate there through fair means. So they pursued a destabilization strategy. And a big part of that destabilization strategy was working with the transgender community in Bangladesh. Now, the interests in Bangladesh were constructing a U.S. military base and seizing the petroleum. And I mean, this was a Republican Chamber of Commerce operation. And yet you had Republicans spending millions of dollars on the Bangladeshi transgender community because they could be easily radicalized and serve as the boots on the ground fodder against the democratically elected government in Bangladesh. And so you had the IRI, which is a CIA front, that it's the Republican arm of NED, which was the brainchild of the CIA director, William Casey, in the 1980s. And its own founder said that they exist because groups become scandalized when they look like they're funded by the CIA. That's why our endowment was created. That's a direct quote to the New York Times in the 1980s when this group was started. It was run by John McCain for 25 years, and Mitt Romney's on the board of directors for what it's worth. So every Republican until Trump has had to move through this group in order to become president. But the fact is you had them funding transgender dance festivals, transgender education clinics, transgender music and cultural events. You had them juicing the financial funnel of the entire network through all these different, philanthropic or arts and cultural styled names. But what you're doing is you're paying the people, you're paying the organizers. Right. I think this was in Amaryllis, Fox Kennedy's, biography that her cover when she was at the CIA was as an art student. So a lot of this happens through this kind of cultural vector, which is just paying political operatives under a civilian front in order to do destabilization work and to counter through often terroristic means, whatever it takes, by any means necessary, as they say, to stop populist support for any sort of movement that challenges the U.S. State Department. So I think in addition to all the current foreign assistance cuts that are happening on censorship grounds or on waste, fraud, and corruption grounds, I think a full review of all of the funding to these transgender identity-based groups. I mean, some of this was sick. What the Biden administration was doing is that sometimes the grants would just be as naked as being LGBT. They would just give out money for being LGBT in the Caribbean. I think there's like a $3 million grant just for one I found as an example. It was just as naked as that, just being LGBT.
Like, go
okay.
be gay on the beach and Biden will give you money.
Right, but what you're doing is you're paying the organizers. This is like when we say we're doing food relief in Somalia. We're just paying warlords. And what you're doing is you're paying these Trans-Antifa warlords to organize.
And like, what better group if you think about the transgender ideology? I mean, I've talked about this a lot. Transgender ideology is queer theory. If you read queer theory, it is an inherently violent, revolutionary Marxist ideology, and it captures the minds of vulnerable young people. Maybe they have gender dysphoria, maybe they don't, maybe they have autism, maybe they don't, maybe they have anxiety and depression, maybe they don't. For whatever reason, when you're captured, when you're a vulnerable young person and you're captured by this ideology, it gives you this tension. It's the Marxist dialectic, right? You're going to be genocided. You're marginalized. You're oppressed. The only way to save your life is to overthrow the oppressors, capitalism and white men and Christians and America. It's an inherently violent Marxist ideology that harnesses pain and brokenness and mental illness in these young people, but it gives them this panic and this fear that if they don't...
Dependency. It is expensive to maintain the treatments over a lifetime. There is a dependency on the money to keep flowing. There's a dependency on the institutions to support you. There's a dependency on a centralized government in order to, protect what the hegemony or the privileged position from any sort of a cultural or social attack vector. And so this is how you have this kind of transjanissary phenomenon. Where that community in particular is a very loyal servant of the blob on foreign policy grounds. And so when you see, for example, the head of Armed Queer Salt Lake City receiving accolades from State Department NGOs and the United Nations for the Sustainable Development Goals, which, by the way, that's a multinational corporation project that secures profits for big businesses in the energy and agriculture and minerals spaces. But you have these kind of armed boots on the ground, groups in the form of these kind of, transjanissary groups, and who readily declare that they are for an armed revolution. I saw one of the banners for armed queers that said the revolution will not be voted in. This is imagine this. And I tweeted this out and I said, there's one thing faster than the speed of light. And that's the speed at which the FBI would descend on a right-wing gun group who called for an armed revolution as opposed to voting.
Can you even imagine? I honestly can't. I mean, you can look back. The left is always liking to point back to January 6th. And I actually think it's apropos in this scenario, because these people on January 6th, many of whom just walked peacefully into the Capitol because someone ushered them in. The Capitol Police let them in. The gates and were already moved. They were charged as terrorists because they thought something fishy happened in the 2020 election. And yet we have these trans groups that are articulating their desire to train for the violent overthrow of the United States. They are celebrating the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and there's very weird and suspicious, I would call it circumstantial evidence. The FBI, I know, is investigating to investigate whether there's proof of it, but there's at very least circumstantial evidence that there was foreknowledge on the part of some people and some groups of this hideous crime that was committed. I mean, the amount of rage that I feel that our government has, they haven't just let us down. They're not incompetent. That they have created this scenario is unbelievable. And we are at the point now, this is the biggest test that members of the Trump administration, cabinet members, that members of Congress, that the president and the vice president themselves will face. What are we going to do to stop this? That's what we're going to talk about next. Mike Benz, I know that you have to go, so thank you for joining us today. You're welcome back anytime. We appreciate your investigative research all the time.
Thank you, Liz. And just as a final point, I just note that what we're talking about here is incitement to violence, which is a very different, it's unseemly when you see left-wing political figures, tarnish, Charlie's reputation or legacy, but that's all fair game. You don't have to love someone, even if they're murdered in a horrific way. It's tasteless to do it, I think, within the 1-2 week or 1 month, whatever period. But that's not what, I'm directing solutions, or it's when you're talking about incitement to violence, when you have these statements like, okay, Andy No next, Matt Walsh next.
Yes.
When you have and when you say it was a good thing that someone was, violently executed, and there should be more of it. These kind of things, when you are endorsing political assassination, which is a very different thing than saying I didn't like the guy, as tasteless as that may be. We do play by the rules on this side of the political movement
exactly right.
aisle. But those rules have to be enforced. When they cross the line to incitement, there has to be consequences.
That's right. There's also a difference between societal repercussions and legal accountability.
Yes.
I'm 100% on board with those who are celebrating, saying, oh, I didn't like Charlie Kirk, he got what's coming, whatever. Those are horrendous things to say, and I'm all on board. Call the school, call their parents, call their job, make them socially ostracized. It's time to make that kind of language socially unacceptable, even if it's not a crime. But there are many, many comments, as you said, that are inciting violence. These are threats. This is not First Amendment protected speech. And we're going to talk about that because Attorney General Pam Bondi made a comment about prosecuting hate speech. She got a lot of flack for it from both the right and the left, and she clarified what she meant. I want to talk about some of the solutions and what we should demand when it comes to not only justice for Charlie, but to dismantle the institutional threat that we're now seeing very plainly is aimed right at us. Mike, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Liz.
All right, we're going to get to Attorney General Pam Bondi, that video that I want to show you in just a second. But first, I want to thank the sponsor for today's episode, Crowd Health. This time of year, insurance companies are hoping that you will just sleepwalk your way into another cycle of overpriced premiums, network headaches, and endless fine print. Oh, I get a shiver thinking about it. It's open enrollment season, people, where they're betting that you won't question anything. But listen to me. You should, because there's finally a better way. Crowd Health is not insurance. It's a community of people like me and my husband who've had enough of the old system and are taking healthcare into our own hands. For under $100 a month, you get access to prescription discounts, lab testing tools, a network of quality doctors, and a team that negotiates medical bills on your behalf. And if something major happens, you pay the first $500, and then the crowd, that's me and my husband and all the rest of us who are part of this, step in to help you with the rest. That's why it's called Crowd Health, because it's essentially crowdfunding. It's what healthcare used to feel like before it got hijacked by bureaucracy and bad policy. Crowd Health members have already saved over $40 million simply by refusing to overpay. You can too. This open enrollment, take your power back. Join Crowd Health to get started today for $99 for your first 3 months if you use my code Liz at joincrowdhealth.com. That's joincrowdhealth.com, promo code Liz. Mandatory disclaimer, Crowd Health is not insurance. I personally like to call it assurance. Opt out, take your power back. This is how we win against the system. Visit joincrowdhealth.com, promo code Liz. Joincrowdhealth.com, promo code Liz. Attorney General Pam Bondi got into a little hot water. She sat down for an interview with Katie Miller. Katie Miller is the wife of Stephen Miller. She recently launched a podcast. They sat down for a long-ranging interview on topics like Pam Bondi's skincare routine. I'm not kidding. And Pam Bondi was asked about the assassination of Charlie Kirk and what she's going to do to address this. And this clip of Pam Bondi has gone viral because she says she's going to prosecute hate speech. Take a look at this.
There's free speech and then there's hate speech. And there is no place, especially now, especially after what happened to Charlie, in our society.
Do you see more law enforcement going after these groups who are using hate speech and putting cuffs on people so we show them that some action is better than no action?
We will absolutely target you, go after you, if you are targeting anyone with hate speech, anything. And that's across the aisle.
Now, Attorney General Pam Bondi got into some hot water from this, from both the left and the right, actually. I don't think there was anybody out there who liked what Pam Bondi had to say, and I didn't like it either. Hate speech. There's no such thing as hate speech. Hate speech is a phrase that was invented by the left, and then the left used it. They defined hate speech as anything that we say on the right that they don't like. So you say that a man can only be a man and can't be a woman. That's hate speech according to the left. You say that that you don't want the COVID vaccine and vaccine mandates are immoral. That's hate speech according to the left. You say that there's something fishy that happened in the 2020 election, hate speech. You name it. The FBI came after parents, who wanted to unseat school board members democratically because they didn't want their kids targeted or indoctrinated with critical race theory and trans ideology, hate speech. There is no exception in the First Amendment to hate speech. That's literally been adjudicated all the way at the highest echelons of our judicial system at the Supreme Court. And Attorney General Pam Bondi, she's the Attorney General, for goodness sake, she should know this. She did, to her credit, clarify this morning with an X post. She said, hate speech that crosses the line into threats of violence is not protected by the First Amendment. It's a crime. For far too long, we've watched the radical left normalize threats, calls for assassinations, and cheer on political violence. That era is over. Under 18 U.S.C. 875C, it is a federal crime to transmit any communication containing any threat to kidnap any person or any threat to injure the person of another. Likewise, 18 U.S.C. 876 and 18 U.S.C. 115 make it a felony to threaten public officials, members of Congress, or their families. You cannot call for someone's murder. You cannot swat a member of Congress. You cannot dox a conservative family and think it will be brushed off as free speech. These acts are punishable crimes, and every single threat will be met with the full force of the law. Free speech protects ideas, debate, even dissent, but it does not and will never protect violence. It is clear this violent rhetoric is designed to silence others from voicing conservative ideals. We will never be silenced. Not for our families, not for our freedoms, and never for Charlie. His legacy will not be erased by fear or intimidation. And listen, I want to be perfectly frank with you. I am not disposed at this point, given Pam Bondi's history this past year, to give Pam Bondi the benefit of the doubt. When I heard Pam Bondi's comment about hate speech on Katie Miller's podcast, that did not make me happy. That did not make me feel that Pam Bondi was qualified for her position, but I have to give credit where credit is due. I'm glad that she clarified, because I'm also not ideologically against this person. If she misspoke, if she meant hate speech differently than you and I understand it, doesn't make her a good communicator. The fact that she used that phrase when she was trying to describe violent speech. But if that's what she meant and she issued an immediate clarification, I'll accept that. Because what she wrote in this post about violent speech, citing specific statutes, federal law against threatening violence and calling for assassination and doxing, that's correct. And that's what the United States government should be doing. When we talk about the United States and we talk about our First Amendment and we talk about free speech, it is a fact. It is a fact that free speech is not absolute. And I know some people are going to say, Liz, what are you calling for? Speech controls? No, not at all. We have laws on the books already right now that demonstrate my point. You can't slander someone. You can't libel someone. That's a crime. You can't threaten them with violence. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. There are certain parameters on our free speech already. This is not a new concept. This is not something that the right is trying to impose on the American public as a result of Charlie Kirk's assassination or in reaction to Charlie Kirk's assassination. This is simply the reality that already exists in the country where we live. These laws are already on the books. It is already against the law to threaten someone. It is already against the law to call for somebody's assassination. It is already against the law to incite imminent violence. It's already against the law to plot for the violent overthrow of the U.S. government. It is already against the law to commit conspiracy against the U.S. government. These things are already against the law. And if they weren't, then Congress should immediately pass a law that makes it against the law. But thank goodness, because Congress is generally incompetent, we already have these laws on the books. So again, while I'm not particularly disposed towards giving Attorney General Pam Bondi the benefit of the doubt, given her behavior and her failures over the course of the past year, I do want to give her credit today, because it seems that what she said on Katie Miller's podcast is not necessarily reflective of what she believes, or at least how the Department of Justice is going to practice. It seems that she was using hate speech. Again, not to defend her, but President Trump is also very savvy at taking phrases away from the left when the left has weaponized a phrase or tried to redefine a word. President Trump is singularly skilled at stopping that. And it seems to me there's been a recent effort by President Trump to try to take the phrase hate speech away from the left, as they've defined it just as our speech and our values that they don't like, and redefine it as violence. And if that's what Attorney General Pam Bondi was doing, okay, that's fine. Maybe she was. I want every person who says you're next to be prosecuted. That's a crime. That's a threat. We should not let that happen. We're 6 days after the assassination of Charlie Kirk? Something needs to be done here. Something needs to be done. So there were a couple of comments over the course of the past couple of days who said, Liz, are you calling for McCarthyism 2.0? McCarthyism 2.0, that's a good start. McCarthyism 2.0, we cannot allow communist ideology to be disseminated from taxpayer-funded institutions. And the free speech absolutists here, it blows my mind that they're like, well, you don't have a right to tell a college professor what he can or cannot teach students. That would be a violation of his right to say those words. No, it's not. Just like it wasn't a violation of the First Amendment rights of the public school teachers in Florida to say, you're talking to these young children that you're teaching about your transgender or your gay lover or whatever it is. You remember the gay teacher that went on, it was either CNN or MSNBC, and cried because he was fired because he'd been talking about his gay lover to the children that he taught at school. And he's like, it's a violation of my First Amendment. No, it's not. You can talk about that, just not in school. Because you don't have a constitutional right. It's nowhere in the Constitution that gives you a right or recognizes a right for you to say whatever you want to school children. This is a government apparatus. You are not allowed to say whatever you want if you are a teacher in school. And that applies to colleges too. Colleges get an incredible amount of money. Their lifeblood is not student tuition. If parents knew what a racket college was, they would not break their bank saving and scrimping and skipping family vacations to give hundreds of thousands of dollars to these colleges that turn their children into hateful murderers and communist ideologues. You do not have a right as a college professor to indoctrinate your students in communism. If you are promoting Marxist ideology, and I'm not talking about history, I'm not talking about educating students about Marxism, I'm not talking about exploring the history of communist thought. Of course we should teach that. That's incredibly important for students to know about. But that's not what's happening in colleges. In colleges, professors who are Marxists themselves are teaching communist ideology as if it's true, as if it's moral. They are making a moral judgment and they are training your children to believe the same thing. And they don't have a right to do that. You have no constitutional right to do that. And it's time we recognize the difference between, sure, it's I guess that professor has a right to be a communist in his viewpoint if he wants, but he doesn't have a right to teach that in the classroom. And it's time we use laws that are already on the books to prevent these things from happening. Listen, President Trump could sign an executive order today that prohibits any kind of instruction in critical consciousness and wokeness and revolution and socialism and communism and Marxism and resistance. Just like we eradicated critical race theory with an executive order, if you propagate critical race theory, you will be deprived of federal funding. That should be true for any communist ideology. Because if you deprive these schools of government money, then they cease to exist. Their lifeblood is government money. It comes from all sorts of things. It comes from state budgets. It comes from federal appropriations. It comes from agencies like the U.S. Department of Education. It comes from the U.S. Department of Labor. It comes from NIH and CDC and all of those types of things, all of those health agencies. It comes from Pell Grants. It comes from federally subsidized student loans. It comes from Medicaid, all the healthcare on college campuses. Medicaid funding goes directly to that. You cut off that gravy train and you have forced these colleges to either radically change their behavior and what they're teaching students, or they're going to close their doors. And when people say, but we need college students, we need some professionals, we need some people to go through college. Well, okay, but if the entire business model of these colleges and universities is actually just indoctrinating students, and they're unwilling to stop indoctrinating in order to maintain their federal funding, then they're not really teaching students how to be whatever, doctors or lawyers or whatever you actually need to go to college to be. There's something we can do to stop this. Attorney General Pam Bondi should prosecute every single person who is threatening and inciting violence. And President Trump should sign an executive order today withholding every penny of federal funding if these colleges and universities or any professor associated with them is teaching communism as if it's right and true and moral, training Marxist revolutionaries. And also, there are fragments of McCarthy era laws that are still in the books, right? There are fragments of laws that don't violate the First Amendment, your First Amendment right to personally hold these viewpoints, not to teach them at taxpayer-funded universities. And they should be used. They should be used against these groups that are plotting the violent overthrow of the United States government. Take the Communist Control Act of 1954, for example. These laws are still on the books. They're in limited form because portions of them have been struck down. But this law declared that the Communist Party USA was a threat. It effectively outlawed it. It restricted its legal rights. It's part of U.S. code still. This is on the books. It hasn't been enforced for a long time. Some legal scholars consider it to be symbolic. But maybe we shouldn't consider it to be symbolic anymore. Maybe we should understand that communism, not just your personal viewpoint, but if you are advocating for this, if you have a group whose goal is to propagate the communist ideology, which calls for a violent overthrow of a U.S. government, that should not be allowed. The Smith Act of 1940, this is another example. Part of this law still exists, not all of it, part of it. It criminalizes advocacy for the violent overthrow of the U.S. government. It's not specific to communism, but it's been used against communists. It's not really used today. Why not? Why not? The Supreme Court overturned part of it, basically narrowed it, but there's a part of it that still stands. The government has to require proof of intent to incite imminent lawless action. I think we have that when it comes to a lot of these radical groups. We have that. Use it. The law's on the book. We talked about some of these things, and I'm going to continue to talk about some of these things because there's going to have to be radical change that happens in our country. This is not going to be political leaders, please make statements asking for the temperature to be lowered in our country. That's not going to work. That's not enough. These radical groups have to be dismantled. And by the way, President Trump has said that he's committed to dismantling these groups. I'm going to show you that video in just a second. But I want to thank Kindred Harvest, who's a sponsor of today's episode. Again, I said this yesterday. These sponsors are not just great because the products that they make are great. They're addressing some need that you have or some desire of something that you want. But they're really courageous people and organizations because they stand by us when we're talking about some of the most difficult topics in our country. And that can bring blowback to these companies even being associated with my show. So please give these companies love if you have the capacity to do that. Kindred Harvest is a great product. My family really likes this. Every day, millions of Americans enjoy a glass of tea, right? But here's the problem. Most of the tea that you would buy in a store is contaminated with microplastics, heavy metals, and yeah, a lot of it comes from China. So Big Pharma and the Chinese tea industry, they do not care if it makes you sick. In fact, you could argue they benefit when you're sick. Kindred Harvest is your alternative. It's blended and packed right here in the USA, so there's no microplastics, no toxins. Every batch is third-party lab tested. Even the sachets are 100% biodegradable, heat-sealed, glue-free, ink-free, just pure, all-natural tea. It is delicious. My husband likes the sleepy time tea. I drank the immunity tea about a month ago when I had one, pretty sure it was COVID. My daughter wants to be just like us. She drinks the cinnamon tea because it is non-caffeine. They have all kinds, morning energy, caffeine-free evening teas, even clean iced tea for kids. Kindred Harvest gives you healthy, honest American quality. So choose Kindred Harvest. Cultivate goodness daily. Visit kindredharvest.co and use code Liz for 20% off. That's kindredharvest.co, promo code Liz. Promo code Liz. Now, President Trump said that he's committed to dismantling these leftist organizations. And I hope that this is true. I have so much faith in President Trump. If I said a few minutes ago that members of his administration, his cabinet, members of Congress, and even he and Vice President J.D. Vance, they're now facing a new moment in our country. It's almost that same transformation that happens when a president suddenly becomes a wartime president. You know, President George Bush was a different president before 9/11 than he was after 9/11. Wartime presidents are different. And that same sort of transformation is going to be necessary within the Trump administration. And it's going to become very clear very quickly which members of President Trump's administration are up for this task and which members of Trump's administration are not up for this task. And I'm so grateful that President Trump is the chief executive at this moment. If there's one person who is qualified for this moment, who understands the hatred that motivated Charlie Kirk's assassin, it's Donald Trump. Because Donald Trump has been subject to assassination attempts. By the grace of God, he survived by what, a fraction of a centimeter? By a fraction of a centimeter. And another member of Trump's administration, Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller says that the last communication he had with Charlie Kirk was Charlie Kirk encouraging Stephen Miller to dismantle these leftist organizations. And when the vice president, J.D. Vance, guest hosted Charlie Kirk's radio show yesterday, he was talking to Stephen Miller, and Stephen Miller related this back and forth that he had with Charlie Kirk, and I want us to take a look at it.
Excellent question. I said this before, but it bears repeating. The last message that Charlie sent me was, I think it was just the day before we lost him, which is that we need to have an organized strategy to go after the left-wing organizations that are promoting violence in this country. And I will write those words onto my heart, and I will carry them out. If people ask me, what emotions I'm feeling right now, this is something people say. I mean, you kind of know the answer. There's incredible sadness, but there's incredible anger. And the thing about anger is that unfocused anger or blind rage is not a productive emotion.
Right.
But focused anger, righteous anger, directed for a just cause is one of the most important agents of change in human history.
Charlie showed that. Amen.
And we are going to channel all of the anger that we have over the organized campaign that led to this assassination to uproot and dismantle these terrorist networks. So let me explain a little bit what that means. So,
we've got 30 seconds, so be quick, Stephen.
The organized doxing campaigns, the organized riots, the organized street violence, the organized campaigns of dehumanization, vilification, posting people's addresses, combining that with messaging that's designed to trigger and incite violence, and the actual organized cells that carry out and facilitate the violence, it is a vast domestic terror movement. And with God as my witness, we are going to use every resource we have at the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, and throughout this government to identify, disrupt, dismantle, and destroy these networks and make America safe again for the American people. It will happen, and we will do it in Charlie's name.
Thank you, Stephen. Don't go.
Amen. If that doesn't give you confidence, if that doesn't give you hope, then I don't know what will besides God in this moment. Do we have, Spencer, the clip of President Trump? Because one of the most important things that President Trump has said over the course of the past couple of days is that he is open, if the Department of Justice recommends it, to declaring Antifa to be a terrorist organization. And you heard what Mike Benz talked about earlier. You heard him say that, the transgender groups around the world, not just here in the United States, but the transgender groups and Antifa are critical parts of the left's orchestrated strategy to foment unrest. And if we have that clip of President Trump, I'd like to play it.
Given with all the that's going on with Charlie Kirk's assassination and the left-wing, a lot of left-wing violence going on, do you have plans, and actually this is a great opportunity with all these, do you plan on designating Antifa finally a domestic terror organization?
Well, it's something I would do, yeah. If I have support from the people back here, I think we'd start with Pam, I think. But I would, if you give me, I would do that 100%. And others also, by the way. But Antifa is terrible.
Are there other groups that you can think of?
There are other groups, yeah. There are other groups. We have some pretty radical groups, and they got away with murder. And also, I've been speaking to the Attorney General about bringing RICO against some of the people that you've been reading about that have been putting up millions and millions of dollars for agitation. These aren't protests. These are crimes, what they're doing, where they're throwing bricks at cars of ICE and Border Patrol. And
Thank goodness. Thank goodness President Trump understands what's going on here. And listen, everything we talked about in the episode today matches the description of what President Trump is talking about. I mean, think about this radical transgender group, this armed queer Salt Lake City group. Not only have they taken money from State Department affiliated NGOs while proclaiming that their principles are violent overthrow of capitalism, promotion of communism, anti-Americanism, not only are they associated with a group from Texas, a Trans-Antifa group that violently attacked an ICE agent, murdered an ICE agent. They went on a trip to communist Cuba where they learned revolutionary tactics, and this group was part or this group was organized by, or this trip was organized by a group that includes NGO members, and these NGO members are Roy Singham affiliated NGOs. I know it's a tangled web. Sometimes it reminds me of that meme of that guy with like trying to draw the lines between all these different points. This is what the left intends to do. They try to confuse you. They try to deceive you. They try to make it impossible for us to untangle what they're doing so that when a crime is committed against one of our own, we just look at the one guy who fired the bullet and we say, well, we'll charge him with a crime. Meanwhile, a vast conspiracy that cultivated this assassination culture on the left was intentional. And it's not okay. And it's not protected by the First Amendment to threaten violence. It's not okay. It's not protected by the First Amendment to commit conspiracy to overthrow the U.S. government or to incite imminent violence. It's not. And thank goodness, thank God, the Trump administration, from President Trump himself to Vice President J.D. Vance to Attorney General Pam Bondi to Stephen Miller, seem to understand the reality of the political enemy that we are facing. Please share this episode on your family group chats, share this episode on Facebook, share this episode on Instagram, on X, text me. It's really important for people to understand. I said yesterday on the show, we are right now being subject to a mass propaganda operation. Like, wartime levels of deception are engaged against you, and they have activated their entire apparatus, from the obvious characters, the obvious players like the mainstream media and Democratic politicians, to online influencers and celebrities, and everybody is lying about Charlie Kirk's assassin, pretending he was a Republican because he came from a Republican family, that he was right-wing, that he was a groyper, that he didn't think Charlie Kirk was conservative enough. No, none of that is true. Charlie Kirk's assassin was a radical leftist who, by all accounts, all pieces of evidence lead us, paint a picture, illustrate a man captured by the transgender ideology, connected to a roommate who wasn't really a roommate, but a transgender lover who was connected on social media to radical transgender organizations and cells. Tyler Robinson himself was part of a Discord chat, at least 20 other people, where he admitted to being Charlie Kirk's assassin. This is not a one-off thing. This is a coordinated conspiracy. And there's a massive propaganda op to try to convince you that that's not true. So please share this episode. We are in the midst of a moment in our nation where not only are we experiencing the Charlie effect, this spiritual revival, because people have encountered evil. And once you encounter evil, you know that there must be something opposing evil. There must be something good. And what is good, if not the author of good? More people than I've ever heard in my life went to church this past weekend because they felt this call from Jesus Christ in the wake of this horrible, horrible assassination. But there's a political awakening that's happening too. People's eyes are opening to the fact that leftist ideology was never about inclusion and diversity and tolerance and equity and all of these fluffy, euphemistic words that pretend to extend compassion to minorities, but are actually masks over violent, revolutionary, Marxist ideology. And people are recognizing this. For the first time, they're recognizing this. They're looking for guidance. They're looking for leadership. They're looking for community. They're looking for answers. Share it with them, please. Invite them to be a part of what you and I do here every day. Give them answers. Give them friendship. Give them leadership, because they're searching for it. Thank you for doing what you do. Thank you for being a part of what we do. I'm deeply grateful for each and every one of you every day. Make sure you're subscribed to the show as well. YouTube.com/Liz Wheeler, X.com/Liz_Wheeler on Spotify. We're the Liz Wheeler Show. Hit subscribe, give us a 5-star review. Thank you for being here for this live stream. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I'm Liz Wheeler. This is the Liz Wheeler Show.